Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben, and today we're stepping into a double murder case that shook America, where the killer was just 15 years old, stabbing his victims 128 times and turning the crime scene into a perfect murder with almost no trace left behind. It was a quiet spring night in Davis, California, a college town known for tree-lined streets and low crime. In the master bedroom of a small condo, 7-year-old Oliver Chip Northup and his wife, 6-year-old Claudia Maupin, slept peacefully under the covers. They had no reason to suspect danger. Their doors were locked. The neighborhood was calm. But sometime in the dark hours before dawn on the 14th of April, 2013, an intruder slipped inside. The method was almost theatrical, cutting a neat hole in a window screen to mimic a burglary, even though the real point of entry was never certain. What is certain is what happened next. The attack was frenzied. When investigators arrived, they were met with a scene that seasoned officers later described as the most horrific, depraved murder they had ever encountered. Both victims had been stabbed again and again, Chip 61 times, Claudia 67. The number alone was staggering, 128 stab wounds. And then came the details that made even veteran detectives pause. The killer had mutilated the bodies, placing a cell phone inside Claudia's abdomen and a drinking glass inside Chip's stomach actions, with no clear motive other than to shock, confuse, or perhaps indulge a private fantasy. Yet, despite the savagery, the crime scene yielded almost nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA. It looked disturbingly like the perfect crime. For weeks, the small city was paralyzed with fear. The brutality suggested rage, but against two beloved community members who seemed to have no enemies? Neighbors double-locked their doors, watched strangers with suspicion, and wondered whether the killer might be among them. Then, a strange anonymous phone call tipped police toward a possibility no one wanted to believe, that the murderer was not an experienced criminal, but someone barely old enough to drive. What kind of mind could carry out such an act, and at such a young age? The answer, when it came, would be darker than anyone imagined. Davis, California wasn't just another quiet college town. It was a place where neighbors waved, church bells marked the weekends, and danger felt like something that happened somewhere else. That sense of safety was part of what drew Claudia Maupin here in 1995. Claudia, then in her late 50s, was a warm, outgoing woman who loved being around young people and new ideas. She had been married before, and after some years single, she began attending the local Unitarian Universalist church. Friends recall her calling one day with excitement she had met someone. That someone was Oliver Chip Northup. Chip was a fixture in Davis, a World War II veteran, a respected attorney, and one of the founders of the very church Claudia attended. He was known for his social activism, his intelligence, and his easy charm. Like Claudia, he had been married multiple times, but family members say their blended households meshed seamlessly. They married in 1996, surrounded by family, friends, and the church community. To those who knew them, Chip and Claudia were inseparable partners, not just in life, but in spirit. They lived in a modest condo, spent time with their children and grandchildren, and remained active in community causes. By 2013, they had been married for 17 years, and neither had reason to believe their lives would be cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The other central figure in this story could not have been more different. Daniel Marsh was just 15 years old. In April 2013, a high school sophomore, tall and thin, with dark hair and an unassuming face. To the outside world, he seemed like a typical teenager navigating school and friendships. But behind that facade, his life was fractured. Daniel's parents had divorced when he was young, after his mother began a relationship with his kindergarten teacher. By his own account, the separation left him seething with anger, particularly toward the woman he blamed for breaking up his family. His emotional struggles deepened over time, manifesting as depression, self-harm, and disordered eating. He spent time in treatment facilities and cycled through various medications. Teachers and peers saw flashes of intelligence, but also a disturbing fascination with violence. Friends later recalled that Daniel spoke often about killing, but they never took it seriously. until they learned he was watching so-called gore porn online, studying real acts of brutality. He admitted to killing a cat, describing it without remorse. Despite these warning signs, Daniel maintained a social circle. One friend in particular would become crucial to this case, not because of loyalty, but because he would later tell police about Daniel's chilling fantasies. In Davis, Claudia and Chip's lives could not have been more separate from Daniel's world. Yet, in April 2013, their paths would cross in a way that defied every expectation of safety, morality, and human empathy. The question that still lingers is this: was Daniel's darkness inevitable, or could someone have stopped him before it reached their bedroom door? Saturday, the 13th of April, 2013, slipped into night without drama. For Chip and Claudia, it was another quiet evening in their condo. They went about their routines, perhaps shared a final conversation before turning off the lights. In a town like Davis, bedtime carried no shadow of fear. But a few blocks away, 5-year-old Daniel Marsh was moving through a very different mental landscape. By his later admission, he had been hunting for someone to kill that night, wandering, searching, driven by an urge that was both calculated and compulsive. He wore gloves, a ski mask, and had taped the soles of his shoes to avoid leaving prints. In his pocket, he carried a knife. Sometime in the dark hours before dawn, Daniel's wandering brought him to the Northup Maupin home. Through an open or partially open living room window, he saw opportunity. Investigators would later debate whether the slashed window screen was a true entry point or a staged diversion. Daniel himself said he cut the screen, climbed through the back, and crept silently inside. The condo was still. In the master bedroom, Chip and Claudia were asleep. Daniel opened the door and stood watching them for several minutes. He later described his body trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. He told investigators he felt exhilarated. "I was actually going to do it. I was there. It was finally happening." What followed was sheer violence. He attacked first with speed, stabbing Claudia and then Chip in rapid succession. The knife rose and fell over and over, Chip receiving 61 stab wounds, Claudia 67. These were not quick surgical strikes. They were repeated, forceful blows, many deep enough to pierce vital organs multiple times. But Daniel didn't stop there. After both victims were dead, he engaged in acts that baffled even seasoned homicide detectives. He cut open their torsos, placing a cell phone inside Claudia's abdomen and a drinking glass inside Chip's stomach. The meaning of these actions, if there was one, remains speculative, possibly an attempt to mislead investigators, or perhaps an expression of a disturbing fantasy. When he was done, Daniel left as silently as he had entered. There were no valuables taken, no sign of a struggle beyond the bedroom. The crime scene, while drenched in blood, offered little in the way of forensic evidence. No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA that could be tied to an outsider. It was as if a ghost had come and gone. The next morning, the 14th of April, members of the church noticed the couple's absence at Sunday service. Claudia was always punctual, always smiling in her pew. Chip was just as reliable. Concern began as whispers and turned to alarm when phone calls went unanswered. Later that day, family members stopped by the condo. From the outside, nothing looked amiss until Claudia's stepdaughter went around back and saw the slashed window screen. Through the bedroom window, she spotted bloodstains. That was enough. Police were called. First responders found the bedroom in chaos, sheets soaked in blood. Signs of extreme violence concentrated on the bed. Chip and Claudia's bodies lay where they had fallen. The sheer number of wounds told investigators they were looking at something far beyond a burglary gone wrong. The mutilation, the bizarre placement of objects. Inside the victims, this was personal, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Word spread quickly through Davis. The idea that such brutality could happen here and with no suspect, no clear motive, shook the community. For weeks, the question hung over every conversation. Who could have done this, and why? Unbeknownst to investigators, the killer was already blending back into ordinary teenage life. Daniel Marsh returned to school. He saw friends. He kept his secret, but he also couldn't resist testing the waters by sharing disturbing details with at least one person in his circle. It would be a phone call 2 months later, from that friend that would finally rip the case open. In the early weeks after the murders, investigators faced a wall of nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no usable DNA. The crime scene had been surgically clean of trace evidence. That in itself was unsettling. It meant the killer either got very lucky or had planned with precision far beyond what they expected. Initial theories centered on people close to Chip and Claudia. The brutality suggested rage, and rage often comes from within a victim's circle. Detectives looked hard at family members, including Chip's own son and grandsons, especially since one of them had a key to the condo. Search warrants followed, carpets pulled up, plumbing fixtures removed, even a disturbing drawing seized from a grandson's belongings. But nothing tied them to the murders. 2 months passed before the break came. On a recorded line, a teenage boy called police. He wanted to remain anonymous, he said, because if his mother found out, she'd send me to military school. What he had to say was shocking. His best friend, 15-year-old Daniel Marsh, had killed the couple. The caller's name was Alvaro Garibay, and detectives quickly realized he knew details never released to the public: how the bodies were mutilated, what objects were placed inside them. Either he was involved, or he was telling the truth about Daniel. Alvaro explained that Daniel often talked about killing, but he never believed him until one night, Daniel told him outright that he had done it. He described breaking in, standing over the bed as the couple slept, then stabbing them again and again. He even admitted trying to remove an eye from one victim, but failing. This was enough for detectives to act. On the 17th of June, 2013, they asked a school resource officer to bring Daniel in. At first, Daniel seemed relaxed, willing to talk. He painted himself as a loner, burdened by family turmoil, depression, and self-harm. He denied any involvement in the murders. For hours, FBI Special Agent Chris Campion and Detective Ariel Pineda worked to chip away at his story. After more than 3 hours, the first cracks appeared. Daniel admitted he was scared of being arrested for 2 murders. Soon after he crossed the line into confession, he told them how he had been hunting for victims, spotted the open window, cut the screen, climbed in, and waited in the bedroom. His description of the killings was chillingly matter-of-fact. Daniel also revealed the measures he took to avoid detection: taping the bottoms of his shoes, wearing gloves and a ski mask, hiding the knife and bloody clothes in his mother's house. When police searched, they found them. With a full confession, Daniel Marsh was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, plus enhancements for the use of a knife. Prosecutors also prepared for what they knew was coming: a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Given his age and mental health history, the defense would argue that Daniel was too ill to be held fully responsible. But the evidence painted a different picture: a teenager, not in the grip of psychosis, but acting with deliberate planning, concealment, and an unsettling pride in his work. Even one psychiatrist hired by the defense agreed Daniel was sane at the time of the killings. As the case moved toward trial, one thing was clear. In a city still struggling to understand how this could happen, the courtroom would have to decide whether Daniel Marsh was a dangerously sick child or a fully aware predator. And the jury would soon hear his own words describing exactly how he did it. The trial of Daniel Marsh drew intense attention not only because of the shocking nature of the crime, but because the defendant was just 15 years old at the time of the killings. The question hanging over the proceedings was not whether he had done it. His confession and the physical evidence left little room for doubt, but whether he should be held fully responsible as an adult. From the outset, the prosecution painted Daniel as a calculating killer. Deputy District Attorney Amanda Zambor reminded the jury that Daniel had fantasized about killing long before he ever took antidepressants or experienced the mental health crises cited by the defense. They played portions of his recorded confession, where he described the murders in chilling detail and admitted feeling amazing afterward. For the prosecution, this was evidence of intent, planning, and a disturbing lack of remorse. They argued that the brutality of the stabbings, the post-mortem mutilation, and the concealment measures were not the work of someone in a psychotic break, but of someone fully aware of his actions. The defense, led by public defenders, pursued a different strategy. Daniel was not legally sane at the time of the killings. They pointed to his long history of depression, suicidal behavior, eating disorders, and alleged side effects from the antidepressant Zoloft. In their narrative, these factors created a mental state so distorted that Daniel could not fully comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions. A psychiatrist hired by the defense, Dr. Matthew Soulier, initially evaluated Daniel but ultimately concluded that while Daniel was mentally ill, he was not legally insane. This was a blow to the defense's case, and Soulier did not testify for them. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with tension. Family members of Chip and Claudia sat just feet from the young man accused of killing them, listening to the clinical recitation of each wound. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene, images so graphic that some looked away. Perhaps the most unsettling moment came when prosecutors played Daniel's casual conversation with an FBI agent about how he might kill the agent himself by choking him with his tie, smashing his face into a mirror, and cutting his arteries. The matter-of-fact tone underscored the prosecution's argument that Daniel's danger to others was ongoing. In closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to focus on Daniel's actions, not his age. The defense pleaded for the jury to consider the depth of his mental illness. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts and sane at the time of the murders. The verdict meant Daniel would be sentenced as an adult, facing a term of 52 years to life in prison. Relief swept through the victims' families, but the case was far from over. In California, changes to juvenile sentencing laws, particularly Proposition 57, meant that Daniel could later petition to have his case moved back to juvenile court, potentially making him eligible for release at age 25. That possibility would soon ignite a second courtroom battle, one where the stakes were nothing less than whether one of California's most notorious teen killers could ever walk free again. Understanding Daniel Marsh requires more than recounting the facts of his crimes. It demands examining the mind that carried them out. On the surface, Daniel fit no obvious stereotype of a killer. He was young, physically slight, academically capable, and not living in abject poverty or chaos. Yet beneath that exterior was a pattern of psychological red flags that, in hindsight, read like a blueprint for escalating violence. Daniel's early life contained fractures that, while not uncommon, may have set the stage for deep resentment. His parents' divorce, his mother's relationship with his former kindergarten teacher, and his perception of betrayal seemed to crystallize into a long-term grudge. By adolescence, he was displaying multiple high-risk markers: self-harm, suicidal ideation, eating disorders, social isolation, and a fascination with violent death. The fascination went beyond curiosity. Friends and acquaintances testified that Daniel consumed gore porn, online videos of real-life executions, mutilations, and torture. This kind of repeated exposure can desensitize viewers. But in Daniel's case, it appeared to feed a fantasy life centered on killing. He admitted to killing a cat simply because he hated that cat's house, an act of cruelty that criminologists often identify as a precursor to violence against humans. From a legal standpoint, the key question was whether Daniel's mental illness impaired his ability to know right from wrong. Multiple experts, including one hired by the defense, concluded that he was not psychotic and understood the nature of his act. This is significant. Daniel did not kill in a frenzy of hallucinations or delusions. He planned, prepared, and took steps to avoid detection. Perhaps most chilling was his own account of the emotional aftermath. He described the murders as amazing, citing feelings of happiness, adrenaline, and dopamine. Forensic psychologist Matthew Logan, reviewing the case later, noted that Daniel exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy: superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and inability to feel genuine remorse. His age complicated the picture. Adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in areas controlling impulse regulation and moral reasoning. Yet Daniel's meticulous preparation, taping his shoes, staging the crime scene, hiding the evidence, suggested a level of executive function that undermined arguments about impulsivity. In criminology, Daniel could be seen as a serial killer in training, someone who, if not caught, might have killed again. Indeed, he told investigators about prowling the streets afterward with a baseball bat, looking for another victim. This ongoing predatory mindset reinforced expert opinions that his dangerousness was not situational, but intrinsic. The case also highlights systemic questions. Could earlier interventions have changed his trajectory? He had seen therapists, been hospitalized, and received psychiatric medications. Yet the leap from troubled teen to double murderer happened without anyone recognizing imminent danger. It raises difficult issues about predicting violent behavior in youths who have no prior violent offenses on record. In the end, the jury's decision to convict and sentence Daniel as an adult reflected a consensus. Whatever his psychological struggles, he retained agency, intent, and awareness. His mental illness explained aspects of his personality. It did not excuse the killings. The next chapter of his story would not be about whether he did it, but whether the law might someday allow him back into society. The verdict in Daniel Marsh's case closed one chapter, but it opened another one marked by legal wrangling, public outrage, and deep unease. In September 2014, he was sentenced to 52 years to life in prison. For the families of Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin, it was a measure of justice, but hardly closure. The brutality of the murders, and the fact that they were committed by someone so young, left wounds that no sentence could fully heal. Then came a shift in California law. In 2016, voters passed Proposition 57, requiring juvenile court hearings to decide if offenders under 18 should be tried as adults. This change meant Daniel could petition for his case to be reconsidered, a possibility that horrified the victims' families. If moved to juvenile court, he could be released at age 25, with no parole supervision. The legal battle that followed brought Daniel back into the public eye. At the hearing, defense attorneys argued he had matured in prison, citing behavioral improvements and rehabilitation programs. The prosecution countered with expert testimony, labeling him a high-scoring psychopath, warning that his risk of reoffending was more likely than not. The judge ultimately ruled against transferring his case, keeping the original sentence intact. Relief washed over the victims' families, but they knew the fight might not be over. In California, changes to juvenile sentencing continue to spark debates, and each change reopens the possibility of review. Beyond the courtroom, the case has been studied in criminology and forensic psychology programs. It's cited as a rare but stark example of extreme violence perpetrated by a teenager with no prior violent criminal record. For some, it's evidence of the need for early intervention in mental health. For others, it's a warning about the limitations of predicting dangerousness in youth. In Davis, the murders shattered the sense of safety that had defined the community. The Unitarian Universalist Church, where Claudia and Chip had met, held vigils and memorials, but the empty seats they once filled remain a silent reminder. Daniel Marsh is now in the California state prison system, eligible for parole only if significant changes to the law occur. For the families, every legal update brings back the same fear, that the boy who once described killing as amazing might one day walk free. And for those who knew Chip and Claudia, their story is no longer just about a crime. It's about the fragility of safety, the resilience of a community, and the unsettling truth that evil can come in the face of a child. The story of Daniel Marsh is a stark reminder that evil doesn't always wear a face we recognize. A 5-year-old teenager living in the heart of a peaceful community was able to hide the darkest thoughts and turn them into brutal action. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question: how well do we really know the people around us? This case also shows the importance of paying attention to warning signs in young people, from sudden changes in behavior, to social withdrawal, to violent fantasies, in their words. Sometimes, a serious conversation or timely intervention can change the course of a life and save innocent lives in the process. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Daniel Marsh was a product of his environment and psychological trauma, or was his nature that of a predator from the start? When it comes to juvenile offenders who commit crimes this severe, do you think they should be given a second chance to re-enter society or held accountable for life? Share your opinion in the comments. Different perspectives can help us better understand where the line should be drawn between justice, forgiveness, and ensuring the safety of our communities.